Get in there, you! No, you can't do this to me, I am you! It's time for a change! Get in the fridge! No! Tropes, in the most simplest of terms, are merely tools for writing. When we think of tropes, we often denote to things such as the chosen one or love triangles. Those are some of the more well-known tropes that people will talk about, but I'm sure that you can probably name a few of tropes without even trying. Here's the thing. There's a bit of a misconception that tropes are bad. You can probably chalk that up to things like YouTubers like me making that claim, oftentimes pointing out tropes and marking them as sins or bad things. However, like I said, tropes are tools, and like any tool, it can be used for good, it can be used creatively, and it can be used poorly. There's a difference between using a hammer to smack a nail down and using it to break your foot. Tropes in and of themselves aren't bad, so I figured we'd take some time and talk about some tropes and analyze how they're good, how they're bad, and how we can improve upon them. With my subjective lens, of course, which is objectively the best lens of all time. I'm MangaKamen, and welcome to Troublesome Tropes. To begin this series, I figured we'd talk about one of the more contentious tropes in recent memory, fridging. Or for those who are more familiar with the origin of the trope, women in refrigerators. And it happens to be a bit of a dangerous trope to talk about, because much like the dreaded Mary Sue character trope, people are completely set in their ways when it comes to defining the trope, and if you dared to speak otherwise, you apparently summon the gremlins of the internet who are a model of the worst on this web. Despite the fact that I believe the tropes aren't exactly niche and there are varying levels to each trope, that there are subtropes to a lot of them. But alas, let's get into it. The trope, Women in Refrigerators, was created by comic book artist Gail Simone, in response to Kyle Rayner, one of the Green Lanterns at the time, a story where his girlfriend was killed and stuffed in the fridge so that Kyle Rayner would vow revenge. Essentially, the trope is to turn the death, or another traumatic event, of a character into a plot device to spur the development of another character, with the victim acting more as a plot device in some of the worst examples in order to provide motivation for another character. Most of the time, the main character. You'll notice that when I gave a brief overview that I refrained from using gendered language in it. You see, while I do believe that there are women in refrigerators and that the trope is real, it only looks at one very specific set of examples. In actuality, the death of or traumatic event of another character forcing the development of another is a such widely used writing device that to merely focus on one gender seems to be a bit of a disservice when discussing this writing tool, especially when the trope can be used in a lot of scenarios with varying types of relationships. One example I can give off the top of my head would be in Kamen Rider W, where the development of one of the two main characters, Shotaro Hidari, is inspired to become more serious and become a detective when he's forced to see his mentor, Sokichi Narumi, die right before him, and it's later revealed that because of Shotaro's actions that his mentor was put in that situation that took his life. My point in bringing this up is that the trope isn't one and done as many people would like to believe, and it's why the term fridging has become a bit more appropriate since the idea can be done to any sort of character, regardless of gender or relationship status. As I've said many times when it comes to tropes, it's not the trope that is used that makes it bad, it's how it's used. So let's take some time and focus on examples of the trope used here, discussing why I believe that makes them good or bad. More often than not, when the character in question is killed off to create that plot point, the character isn't really a character. They're more or less a tool who doesn't get any actual development, but has what you can consider to be a character since they're used to incite the characterization for another personality. Try saying that 10 times fast. This is what we call a disposable character, or if you prefer, expendable. And that's because when a character is used this way, they're often forgotten by the characters, the writers, or even in some instances, they get replaced. Let's start with an example from the Ace Attorney series.
Objection! There's a glaring contradiction in the witness's testimony.
If you're not familiar with the iconic visual novel series, you play as an attorney. Most of the time it's Phoenix Wright, but in other entries, you have other attorneys you can play as. You basically solve different crimes to the courtroom and use deductive reasoning to do so. The series has a lot of clever writing and entertaining elements to it, as well as being probably one of my favorite stories growing up. However, the first example I'm talking about is Dual Destinies, the 5th game in the mainline series, more specifically the character Clay Terran. What's that? Who's Clay Terran? He's Apollo Justice's best friend since childhood. However, until the game of Dual Destinies, there was no actual mention of Clay at all. Which is weird, because in Dual Destinies we get a flashback to Apollo's past, showing that the two were close in school, but other than that, he wanted to be an astronaut and then he had looked up to another astronaut. There's not much you can really say about the character, though. Especially since we don't get a chance to see how the two actually interacted, and he's actually dead before we learn anything of the character in the game. As it turns out, Clay was killed by the hands of the big bad guy who had framed another character in the game, Athena Sykes, who was the newest attorney on the Phoenix Wright team, and as such, Apollo had developed trust issues with the newest character. Bum bum bum! The idea of Apollo trying to get to the bottom of his friend's death is solid, but there really should have been some actual character made for why he acts this way he does in the game. We should have had at least one actual scene between Clay and Apollo in the current time period, showcasing that the two were close friends, and even worse when you consider that the next game had a major focus on Apollo as a character, there's no mention of Clay. The character who supposedly was enough to turn Apollo into a walking ball of angst with an edgy look is just forgotten. Clay's just used for Apollo's characterization that ultimately doesn't really matter for Apollo's story. The biggest issue with fridging a character like this is that they're not really a character, they're a plot device. And there are a lot of characters in Ace Attorney that are like this, some more egregious than others, but funnily enough, there's actually an example of what I'm talking about, how this sort of story can be done, and it's in Ace Attorney as well.
I'm determined to bring about change in our legal system.
The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles is a more unique set of games, especially for this series, as we actually go back to the 19th century to play one of Phoenix Wright's ancestors, Ryunosuke Naruhodo, who incidentally had no actual interest in becoming an attorney. That was his friend Kazuma Asogi who wanted to become the attorney instead. However, when the two were on a ship to Great Britain so Asogi could continue his study into the law, Asogi was killed, and Ryunosuke was accused of his murder. Of course, Ryunosuke is innocent, and decided to take on the dream of his best friend, and became an attorney in the process. Now, how is this different from the Clay example? Well, not only does the motivation continue throughout both Ace Attorney games, but we also get a chance to learn about Asogi before he dies. In the first case, we as the players, when we control Ryunosuke, get to work alongside him in order to prove that Ryunosuke didn't commit a crime. It allows the players to actually have a chance to connect with Asogi, but even if they don't form the same connection that Ryunosuke does, they will see that there is a connection of trust and camaraderie between Ryunosuke and Asogi, establishing that the two are close as friends. And even after Asogi's death, Ryunosuke doesn't forget about his friend, and in fact carries on his dream, and has a symbolic memento of Asogi in the form of Asogi's katana that Ryunosuke carries with him at all times. So the death of Asogi does affect Ryunosuke for development, but because of the setup, Asogi actually feels like a character, and it makes sense for Ryunosuke to act this way. Now, I could go into spoilers for this game series, but I prefer if you guys got invested with the Great Ace Attorney series. After all, it's a great pair of games with a lot of great cases, fun characters, and will actually make you think. Don't let the zombies of Reddit tell you otherwise. Before we get to the next segment though, I think we should talk about one more prominent example. The Last of Us and its sequel.
If someone confronts you, brain them, like so.
Hey, I'm talking to you.
Using the X button.
What's an X?
I don't have to really explain this sort of setup for you, most people are familiar with the series, and we've talked about the series a few times on this channel, especially with the elements of death. Most notably about the main character of the first game, Joel. How in the first game he lost his daughter Sarah, and how in the second game he died in order to provide motivation for Ellie's revenge. Now, there have been some online debates as to how there's been a bit of a fridging problem in the Last of Us series, and you can see there are elements for both games where a character for the main character dies to provide motivation for them. But here's the rub, in order for fridging to be used this way, the character that dies has to be used to push another character into doing something. Joel's death is used as an emotional hook for the players. Most people who play the sequel will have played the first and already have an emotional connection to him. This game has been remade and remastered so many times it's ridiculous and people should have an idea for it. Back to my point, Joel's death is what gets the story going since that's the plot of Ellie's Ideas, where she's hunting down Joel's killer Abby, and someone's gotta watch this drive.
Now watch this drive.
Here's the thing. Joel, as a major character, gets killed off in order to have his death be used as a plot device, instead of giving a more satisfying conclusion to the character. He had an arc and a story, meanwhile Sarah didn't. Sarah was meant to be used as a means to propel Joel into his mindset in the first game, but her death didn't spur his actions. Sarah's death isn't responsible for the events going forward. However, Joel's death is used to fuel Ellie's grief, which pushes her to kill God knows how many people in her pursuit of Senator Abby Armstrong. In both scenarios, the death of a loved one causes grief that affects the characters, but there's a big difference between Sarah's death and Joel's death. Let me put it like this. When we talk about character motivations and how the death of a loved one can affect them, there's a simple question you need to ask. Why this character? With Sarah, her death was necessary as it would affect Joel as a person, but her death isn't what motivates him to do his actions. It's what turned him into a jaded person for sure, but Sarah's death didn't motivate Joel to do anything. For all intents and purposes, she isn't meant to be a character, but she's more or less used as backstory for Joel. I wouldn't say she's disposable because her death is used throughout the game as a parallel to the budding relationship between Joel and Ellie. It ties into the themes of love and grief that the game is trying to convey to the player. If Sarah didn't die in the beginning of the game, it would be a lot weaker for it. In contrast, Joel's death being the motivator of grief and revenge for Ellie's actions isn't as solid. Let's play a hypothetical for a moment. Ignore the backstory of Abby and let's go down a different route. Instead of Joel dying, let's pretend that Ellie's love interest, Dina, was the one that was killed. You'd still have grief and revenge being used as a motivator for Ellie's actions. This is only a thought experiment, however, and I have to point out that the narrative is the sequel is really messy since Ellie never really develops out of her grief. She just gets over it while fighting Abby at the end and spares her. Ellie doesn't learn Abby's motivations, she doesn't understand Abby as a character, so when sparing her it makes no sense considering the motivation that Joel's death is. And that's why I think Joel as a character in the second game is more disposable, since if you're going to fridge a character like this for development, you need to actually have that development take place for Ellie. To make it clear, just because a character is killed off for a motivation or development, that isn't the problem here. The problem is how the character is utilized and if they're actually important to said motivation and development. Asogi and Sarah's deaths are key elements to how Ryunosuke and Joel act throughout their respective games, and are used to help solidify their characterizations. Their deaths aren't just forgotten, or used flimsily to push a message. I can't really say the same for Clay or Joel's deaths though. I will be completely honest, they aren't on the same level, since Joel obviously was a developed character with a full-blown arc, but the issue of his death was that it was only used as motivation and not actually used for development of Ellie, which is what I think is probably one of the major issues that people have with fridging characters. Of course, the death of a loved one can change a character, and if the event happens recently, it can have some cynical effects on them. I want to start this section off by explaining what cynicism is. Trust me, this will make sense for what I'm talking about. Cynicism, for better or worse, is a bleak outlook on other people. You tend to believe in the worst of them. For example, if you believe all politicians are greedy jerks, or that YouTubers are nothing more than lazy scammers. Although for both of those examples, I can't really fault anyone for thinking that. Reputation is a thing.
I've made a severe...
But to go even deeper, cynicism comes in various types. There's the black and white cynicism, where you just ignore gray areas between good and bad. Defensive, when obviously it's used as a means of guarding yourself from unknown elements. Being overly skeptical, nihilism, and many, many more. This isn't a video on the topic, but rather when the death of a loved one, especially when it's done in a tragic way, you'll often get into the trope that is called the cynicism catalyst. We've all seen it. It's often when they take the idealistic character, but then a terrible event happens and they plunge into the darker methods, or essentially turn into villains. It's a branch off the fridging trope, since a lot of times it causes this sort of behavior in characters. It can be used well or poorly. One of my favorite examples, and one that's really easy to spot, is Metal Gear Rising Revengeance. Yes, Raiden does have a lot of baggage. Most people who are familiar with the badass cyborg ninja will be familiar with his past as a child soldier, and the fact that most of his body was replaced. There's also the mess of Metal Gear Solid 4, where, well, that's just a whole other bag of mess right there. But he used those elements for the sake of justice, justifying slicing down bad guys for the sake of doing the right thing. However, when confronted by Jetstream Sam in the game...
Seriously now, Raiden, isn't this all a bit much? Any decent lunatic would have quit after Mexico. I heard you dropped the land director in half. Old habits die hard, eh, Jack? But now here you are, the child soldier, fighting for the children. Please, what do you really expect to accomplish here?
And then Raiden learns that a good number of the soldiers that he was facing didn't have a choice in the matter. Literally hearing their suppressed thoughts, Raiden effectively grows numb for this. And this is even shown in the gameplay, as after this section, Raiden is sluggish, at least until he makes his way to the destination where we get this infamous section.
After the Patriots, I thought I could walk off the battlefield and into a normal life. But here I am, surrounded by death, arguing philosophy with terrorists. I told myself this was about justice, about protecting the weak. But I was wrong. I learned young that killing your enemies felt good. My friends, my family, they helped me forget the devil inside. But who am I kidding? I was born to kill! The bit about my sword, that means of justice stuff, I guess I needed something to keep the Ripper in check when I was knee-deep in bodies. All this is a wake-up call to what I really believe. What I really am. Jack is back.
Like I said, this is an easy example of Spot, and yes, it's certainly an over-the-top way of displaying this and showing how people can change due to trauma.
Now you're just being nasty.
But that's kind of the point I'm getting at. These events can trigger such a change in people. Ryan's a bit more complicated, since this is more of a straw that broke the camel's back sort of deal. There are other instances of the Cynicism cataclysm being forced upon a frigid character, and it does play into more drastic character changes or how it can be used as a means for the entire story. We discussed one example for character change in the case of Apollo Justice, where he became a lot more distrustful of his fellow attorney, thinking she had killed his friend. But let's go with a different example, and one that's a bit more in line with a drastic change of characters. Persona 4. So throughout the game, one of the prevailing elements of the story is that you form a bond with the character Nanako, the daughter of your uncle that you're living with in Inaba. The game does a good job of showing that the girl is usually lonely mainly because of her father's job keeping him away and how her mother passed away. Even if the player doesn't actually connect with this character, and why wouldn't you because you're a monster, the game does a good job of showcasing that the rest of the party does have a connection with Nanako. If you have any sort of deductive skills, however, judging by the point of this video, in Persona 4, Nanako can die. In the later half of the game, Nanako gets kidnapped by the person who's been throwing people into the TV world, which has killed plenty of others, Namatame. The stress of being in the TV world is a bit too much for Nanako, and she'll pass away afterwards. As such, when we see the normally fun-loving group that has been gung-ho on the investigation, an investigation about murder... that's weird. We see a distinct change in the characters, even to the point where they're willing to push Namatame into the TV world since there would be no way to prove that Namatame was behind the kidnappings, let alone the murders that occurred at the beginning of the game. The game plays with this, since if you don't make the right choices, the party gets caught up in the heat of the moment and will effectively kill Namatame, which, if you as well get caught up in the emotional heat of the situation, well, congratulations! Not only do you have the heroes kill the wrong guy, Nanako is dead for good, and the fog from the TV world continues to seep out into the real one. Even the end credits tell you how screwed up this situation is. It should also be noted that during this scene, the most logical member of the group, Naoto, the detective prince who makes a suggestion on how to kill Namatame. It makes a lot of sense since these characters had developed a relationship with Nanako, and when she died, it visually affected them, and it brought out the darker elements within each member of the investigation team. It's a scene that remains in my mind, that the characters just act so different from their usual personalities, and they will actively fight against you if you don't let your emotions take control of you and you want to figure out the true mystery. Seeing characters being racked by their emotions and seeing their reactions is what we love, and how they deal with those emotions is what make great fiction. Do they fall into the emotional trap that'll change them forever, or do they face out, hold out, reach out to the truth of their life, seeking to seize on the whole moment to break away? Sorry, it's one of my favorite RPGs out there. There are other examples I could go into, like if I wanted to stick with the Persona series, we could talk about Joker. No, not that Joker. This Joker, who essentially started the entire plotline of Persona 2. But I feel like talking about Joker and Persona 2 would require its own video, but I think we should move on to another attribute of fridging that needs to be brought up in this video. There's a reason I want to talk about fridging for the first episode. It's because death is a powerful narrative tool. So to round out this video, we'll talk about one of the most iconic deaths of a woman in media and how her death is effective and contradicts complaints of fridging. One where there is discussion, and even more so considering that the piece is getting an updated rendition soon, this should be an opportune time to talk about it. And that would be Aerith from Final Fantasy VII. It's something that almost anyone who's been a part of gaming, whether you love or hate the Final Fantasy series or just 7 in particular, you know this scene where Aerith gets killed by Sephiroth. But for those who aren't, we meet Aerith rather early in the game, first in the opening animation, and after you do your civic duty to protect the environment, we come across her as a nameless flower girl where you can buy a flower from her. Now, one thing to note is that you can obviously tell she's going to be important to the story. Would you look at that? She does. FF7, especially for its time, does a good job of intertwining Aerith into the plot, with Shinra after her because she's an ancient, a mythical people who have a connection with the planet, even to the point where she gets kidnapped by them, and you as Cloud Strife and his group of friends are going off to rescue her. Alright, so we got a pretty quick establishment of the characters here. Now we'll get to how Aerith's death is effective. The first is that we're given a proper bait and switch, and this is one that's actively done in the game properly and not used as the advertisement where it can be considered dishonest. We're introduced to another character, Katesith. Whatever. He's a fortune teller, and one of the first fortunes he gives you goes, what you pursue will be yours, but you will lose something dear. Simple foreshadowing. Since we're following Sephiroth, the main villain of the game, it provides the idea that one of our party members will die, and later on we actually get that. When we're trying to get the black materia, the thing that Sephiroth is after, in order to acquire the dangerous item, someone has to remain in the temple, answering questions, and with every question answered, the temple shrinks because it's the black materia. So we do lose a party member, Katesith. The scene gets played up, the character is making a big sacrifice, and despite him being a spy for Shinra, he came to really trust the party through their travels. Thus, he sacrifices himself. However, after Cloud gets manipulated to give Sephiroth the black materia, Katesith too pops up. Yeah, he's actually a robot controlled by a Shinra employee, Reeve. This is how the bait and switch plays into effect. The game takes probably the most expendable character in the game, kills them off, and immediately replaces them with a carbon copy. It lulls the player into thinking that death isn't really something to worry about, at least when it comes to the actual party members. And hey, it's not like this sort of thing hasn't been documented in games, especially RPGs, where characters are thought to be dead or are dead, but are essentially brought back to life. It's a standard fare for these kinds of stories, cause a lot of the time, the characters are what people will cling to. Players don't want to see their favorite characters die, and as such, Final Fantasy VII uses it to lull the players into thinking that death isn't really an issue. But what happens next in FF7? Oh, Aerith runs off, aiming to stop Sephiroth's plan in the Lost City of Ancients, and Sephiroth outright tells Cloud and the player that he's going to kill Aerith right before she can muck up his plans. And here's the rub. Cloud has worries that since he was controlled by Sephiroth before, he could be manipulated again to kill Aerith with his own hands. This uncertainty is supported by this foreboding track. Playing this as a kid always freaked me out, always made me feel like if I played this section of the game in the dark, there was something creeping behind me. I hated it, and I loved it at the same time. Then we come to the moment. We manage to find Aerith before Sephiroth does, but as we move Cloud closer, something isn't right. The game then does something a little underhanded. Cloud is under Sephiroth's control, and so the player, no matter what you do, whatever action you choose, Cloud will take out his Buster Sword, raise it over his head, and the party members you brought with you will stop you from killing Aerith just as he's about to bring down his sword. It's a relief. It makes you feel like, yeah, nothing bad's gonna happen to Aerith. We were able to break out of Sephiroth's control and... Well, son of a bitch. The game fakes you out, and it breaks the fake death that Katesith had earlier. Aerith isn't coming back, and it showcases that death can come out of nowhere, taking away the ones we care about at a moment's notice. But what really makes this death work well is the impact it has, not just on Cloud, but on the rest of the characters and story. After her death, the other 2 party members that you brought with you will pay their respects to Aerith, and then we'll cut to the iconic scene of Cloud putting Aerith to rest in a lake. Now, how is this not fridging Aerith? First, we need to recall at the time of her death, we don't know exactly what Aerith was trying to do to stop Sephiroth. Her reasoning is taken with her to the grave. Later on, we learn that Aerith was performing a prayer to cast Holy, the only force that would have been able to stop Sephiroth, and the meteor that would be summoned by black materia. One of the primary telltale signs of how a character can be fridged is that the goal is to mainly affect the main character. Much like how at the beginning of the video when I talked about Kyle Rayner and how his girlfriend's death was made to vow revenge against the villain who did the deed. Hell, even Sephiroth proves this by asking if Cloud could even have feelings since he's just a puppet to him. Throw in the fact that if you're Sephiroth, and who wouldn't want to be the silver-haired whoopee Sephiroth? Ah! Ow. And you were trying to destroy the world with a giant meteor? Wouldn't you kill the one woman who was attempting to thwart your plans? One of the reasons why this death scene works for Aerith, it cements why Sephiroth works as a villain as well. With one felt swoop, he made everything much more personal for the entire team, all the while making his action not personal to him at all. Sephiroth's choices have nothing to do with motivating Cloud. To Sephiroth, Cloud is nothing more than a pawn for him to play with. Sephiroth views himself as the superior life form, and everything else is nothing more than insects that he can easily kill, just like how he easily killed Aerith. Speaking of the Ancient, how does her death impact the story? Well, it was because of Aerith that the world would be saved. It was because of her efforts that Holy would be unleashed, and even after she left this mortal coil, her efforts saved the world. It's why at the end of the game, when you're watching the final scene of Final Fantasy VII, it ends with Aerith looking at the player, symbolizing that she was probably the one who made Holy actually destroy the meteor. Aerith wasn't stuck in a fridge to die, rather her death put her where she needed to be for the story, and it wasn't used to just force a change in the main protagonist. There was meaning in the death, and Aerith was a fleshed out character as well, and her story ended not at her death but when Holy took effect. To me, Aerith is the gold standard for when you talk about characters' deaths. Fight me! Death is a part of life. Everyone will lose someone they love and care about to the Reaper eventually, and that's why when fiction depicts death, a lot of times you'll find it be used improperly. Especially for when it's characters who are considered disposable, it can really feel cheap. There are a lot of ways to abuse the concept of death in fiction, and don't get me wrong, I would love to cover topics more and more in this series, and frankly that's why I'm doing this. I love the idea of examining tropes and how they're used in media, as well as discussing the effects they have with characters. I said it earlier in this video, but I'll say it again. Tropes are tools, and tools can be used properly and they can be misused. You can either use a knife to cut food, or you can stab a toaster with it. Dumb bastards. Fridging, or if you prefer the moniker of women in refrigerators, is also a trope, and while some people who have compiled actual lists of characters who would fall into this trope, I still maintain that focusing only on one gender for a trope minimalizes the poor writing. The basic concept is to cause a change in a hero or the main cast. It's an older trope and one that can even be found in tales such as Gilgamesh, Heracles, or even Achilles. But as I've demonstrated, there are plenty of male characters whose deaths are used to prop up character changes, and sometimes they're done poorly. Or if you want a more comic book related example, you should check out Wonder Woman's love interests, Steve Trevor and Trevor Barnes. Or if you want to spread out a little bit, characters like Uncle Ben, Obi-Wan, Thomas Wayne, Jason Todd, and the plethora of other male characters that fit the bill for fridging. Fridging isn't a case of women having tragedy to strike them to motivate the guys. It's a case of supporting characters, regardless of gender, to drive the hero of any type to action or change. And the fact of the matter is, we're not going to stop seeing this trope appear in fiction. Why, you may ask? Drama. It creates drama for stories. Instead of just focusing on who dies or how, we should ask the right questions when it comes to fridging. Is this an actual character? What does their death do? Does the rest of the cast get over the death? What does this death do for the story? Did Truck-kun claim another victim? These and more questions I feel are more important to ask when you talk about a character's death in a story, and focusing on things such as the character's gender takes away from the more interesting conversation. This isn't me saying that there isn't some discussion to be had about a character's gender and their death, but I honestly find it to be a lot more boring of a conversation. There have been some legit terrible things done to female characters that can be some of the most disgusting shit that can be very sexist, but by that same token, I also recall similar things being done to male characters. The bigger issue to me is how the events can be poorly written, and a lot of the time these deaths can and will be used for shock value. It's not something that I really appreciate in writing, especially when it's a continuous trend. However, it's time I turn the mic to you guys. Do you agree with my assessments to this topic? Do you think fridging is inherently sexist, or do you disagree with that notion? That's what the comments section is for, and this, my friends, is where we say goodbye for now. I'm MangaKamen, and thank you for watching. Till next time, folks.